Gumba Malgang, Gumba Nanangian Kadu, Yuruguri, State Library of Queensland, which is good evening. It's good to see you and welcome friends to the State Library of Queensland. It's certainly fantastic to see you all and thank you for coming out during these times. My name is Vicky McDonald and it's my great privilege to be the State Librarian and CEO here at State Library of Queensland. And on behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you to our second Research Reveals event for the year. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. We're inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Alison O'Sullivan, sitting in the front row. And Alison is an historian based in Sydney where she works in public programming for heritage institutions and pursues her love of social history. And she is also the 2020 John Oxley Library Honorary Fellow. This fellowship is awarded annually to support researchers of all disciplines, historians, writers and creatives to uncover Queensland's rich and diverse history, utilising the resources of John Oxley Library and the State Library of Queensland collections. And this leads to the creation of new knowledge inspired by Queensland's history. This evening, Alison will share research from her project in their own words, Women Diarists of Colonial Queensland. And her project explores the fascinating collection of largely unpublished diaries of women who lived in colonial and early Federation-era Queensland. While Alison's focus is on the diaries, she uses other sources such as newspapers and genealogical records to help to complete our understanding of these women's lives. Her research places them in the context of their general environment, the location, politics and major events of the time. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing about Alison's research findings and invite you to join us at the end of her presentation to review a selection of the wonderful diaries from our collection. I do encourage you to participate in the conversation by sending your questions via Slido for the Q&A session at the end of tonight's talk. And Gavin, I guess you're going to facilitate that again for us, so thank you. So Gavin Bannerman from Queensland Memory. And Slido is really good. It's very democratic. As people put in their questions, you can vote for the questions and they'll slide to the top and we'll be able to take those questions. And details of how to participate in that will pop up on the screen throughout tonight's conversation. But finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank the support of donors through the Queensland Library Foundation for their enthusiastic support of the award and also the work of State Library of Queensland. The donations through the Queensland Library Foundation enable us to offer the suite of fellowships that to enable the further research that's undertaken. And this support also, of course, enables us to deliver the Queensland Memory Awards each year. So if you're interested in supporting the fellowships through the Queensland Library Foundation, I encourage you to have a chat with myself or any of my colleagues who are here this evening. But for now, please join me in welcoming Alison to the stage. So over to you, Alison.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you to everyone from the State Library of Queensland, from the John Oxley Library, everyone involved in the Queensland Memory Awards, and everyone who's helped bring this fellowship to fruition. I'm glad to finally be here. I've got to say, being from Sydney, it's been a challenge, but I got here in the end. This fellowship's been an amazing opportunity for me, but as you can understand, it's presented certain challenges that no one could have seen coming as well, because I've had to try and work with collections and archival material that was in a completely different state. The project began in September of 2020 with the aim of telling the story of only 3 women. I wanted to really concentrate on 3 who led very different lives. So I just wanted to explore the similarities and differences between the experiences of colonial women migrants to Queensland. I wasn't able to get up here until December of that year. And of course, for most of 2021, I wasn't able to get back here either. Once I got here that December, I decided to cast as wide a net as possible and behave as though this would be my only opportunity to access the archives, which as it turned out was 100% accurate. So that strategy proved to be quite a wise move. I was able to go home with images of all the material that I needed and work from home. So I examined approximately 30 to 40 diaries rather than just the original 3, as well as related collections and ephemera, including letters, some herbariums, which are collections of pressed plants, the flowers, and autograph books as well. So the main things I was looking for was, first of all, to gain a sense of what was actually available in the archives. Secondly, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't overlooking anything special by initially starting with too narrow a focus. And I am so glad that I did this. I'll come back to that later because we've really, really found some extraordinary things that I wasn't originally aware even existed. And I also wanted to get overall just a good sense of the social and historical context of the materials that I was working with. So different styles of diary keeping, and I wanted to be able to spot the similarities and differences so that I could see anything unusual in women's methods or experiences as they were relating them. We were just talking earlier about the different styles. It's interesting, some women keep these diaries just as an aide de memoire. It's just really what happened that day. Other women set out to really create a narrative from the outset, and they're really quite extraordinary to read. They're writing them as if it's a story they someday want someone else to enjoy. So we'll go through a few different styles later on. This whole situation we've been in also affected how I went about my idea working in Sydney, because I was also going to go and check out supporting materials from the other major archives. So the National Maritime Museum holds relevant material down in Sydney, also the State Library of New South Wales. But because of all the lockdowns down there, these have often been closed. And even when they were open, honestly, there's so much COVID in Sydney, I just didn't want to go in, to be honest. So I've pivoted a little bit. I made the decision to concentrate just on what I'd collected up here. And it became obvious that the wealth of material available to look at these stories was more than enough. It was so much bigger than I first imagined. So I broadened the project. It's no longer about those 3 diaries. Likewise, the original idea of presenting the results in a published book or a published form has been superseded in favour of a website, as I really feel that these stories should be available to as wide an audience as possible. I have created a website to this end, and I'll introduce it properly at the end of the presentation. The website exists somewhere in the space between a blog and an e-book, so it's designed to introduce everyone to the history behind these, the collection here at the library. Going into this project, I knew there would be a predominance of wealthier diarists, which comes down to a combination of education, leisure time, social expectations of how ladies occupied themselves as well. But there are also examples from less well-off women who buck this stereotype, and they provide a really valuable description of the lives of really hard-working women on the land and in the cities as well. But still, the diaries only reflect the experiences of certain kinds of women. We have to accept they're all literate to varying degrees. They're entirely of British or European heritage. So this is not a holistic view of colonial Queensland. We need to understand that we're still looking at it through a relatively narrow lens. With very few exceptions that I just mentioned, we're lacking input from women who had less access to education or to writing materials, women of a non-English speaking background, and those who just don't come from a culture who perform diary keeping as a pastime or a hobby. These women do describe the lives of some of these women, though. Some of the women, such as Isabella Elliott, who I've written about on the website, she sometimes talks about her maids, and it's interesting to see that insight into the lives of the women who worked for her as well. These are women who are often quite invisible in these records. They also, several of the diarists record their interactions with First Nation peoples of Queensland and northern New South Wales. And these external observations are no substitute for the histories and voices of First Nation people themselves, obviously, but they do give us valuable insights into the uniqueness of some of the individual relationships between colonists and Aboriginal people. One of the examples, there's the Gray sisters, one of the Gray sisters, who were out in a remote area, actually went hunting and fishing with some of the local women up there. So there wasn't necessarily that separation that we've come to believe existed. They do also reveal, of course, some misconceptions, some prejudices, which were quite typical for the era, but these are also valuable in that they help us understand our history as part of a bigger picture. I have also attempted to give them further context, as was mentioned, by using other primary and secondary sources. The library and Trove digitised newspapers are brilliant for that, and also a lot of genealogical records too. They help me fill out an idea of what these women were contending with, so the diaries don't necessarily mention their entire extended family, but I can work out, you know, if they're visiting someone, they just use their first name. I can work out, for example, that that's a cousin, that's their mum, that's, you know, the neighbour up the road, by using all these great records that are available online now. So if I was asked to pick a couple of words that encapsulated this project for me, they would be discovery and connection. So discovery in the sense that every diary is completely different. Every woman has a different style. They have different ideas, different interests. They're very individual. You have no idea what you're in for and nothing is signposted. So you can't really have expectations of what you'll find when you start reading. And the diaries are often genuinely exciting in this respect. For example, there's a story in one, Helen Ferguson's, of this really daring nighttime rescue of this little girl from a flooded river in the middle of a storm. It's the middle of the night. Just by chance, she comes across someone who's lost in the storm and hasn't been able to get the carriage home. So she's trying to help this woman get home. And they go down to the river to see if it's possible to cross with the ferry. And there's this child there. So they rescue the child. Hours later, they come across the dad who's in an absolute fit. He thinks his child is gone. And it's really quite gut-wrenching to read the story of the reunion. I'm tearing up as I'm thinking about it. How terrible. But it really was. That's how much they've affected me, reading some of these diaries. They're really beautiful stories. So connections is a word I really felt summed up this collection, because the connections are always there and in the most unexpected ways. It's like the idea of 6 degrees of separation. It's why good general knowledge can be really important when reading these kinds of records, and also keeping up your research as you're reading. So every time the diarist mentioned something that I wasn't familiar with, I'd put the diary away, and I would actually go and I would gain new information, make the connections and come back. Diaries also, of course, connect you to the past, to places, events and people, and they can also connect you to other objects, and in some cases they've actually connected us to other items in the John Oxley collection. We've found connections between the diaries and images and other things, and I'll show you some examples. You feel like a bit of a detective doing this. It's quite fun. I do tend to go down rabbit holes sometimes. Sometimes they're dead ends and sometimes they pay off, so it's always fun though. Recently we've seen the diaries of travellers and colonists used to great effect in works such as Bruce Pascoe and Paul Irish and various authors of recent years. Colonial era diaries are a great account of how things were at the moment of arrival for Europeans in any place. They can describe what was there. So they tell us what has changed, and that's really fun. These writers have tended to favour men's journals and diaries because they're the famous explorers. They're the ones who wrote these, you know, they're the most obvious ones to go to. And we tend to think of women diarists as leading these relatively sheltered, sort of interior kinds of lives. And I think it's a shame they're a little bit overlooked in that respect. They're a really important research or just a source of material for this history, because they are, of course, there and they are observing just as much as the men are. The diaries cover a wide gamut of topics. I won't go on for too much longer. We'll go into an example soon. But obviously all of their immigration, their shipboard life, homesickness and trepidation at the journey, as some of them are excited to be coming, some of them are miserable that they're leaving home. Some did it really tough, some were quite privileged, some made good when they got here. You know, some of them came out for the legend of the opportunity in the New World, and they did quite well. And of course they travelled. So all of these women, everyone who came here saw half the world on the way here. So they've got a lifetime of experiences just crammed into those few weeks that they were on board ship. And some of the diaries are amazing just for their descriptions of all the places on the way through. One young woman I wrote about on the blog was, I keep forgetting it. So it was Agnes Learmonth. She was a Scottish teenager who was about 18 years old when she migrated to Australia with her family. That was her parents. It was a big extended group, an aunt, a brother, sister, and a sibling and a spouse as well. So Agnes records all the normal shipboard news, but what I thought was great was she recorded this ceremony, which is the crossing the line ceremony. This is obviously not photographs from her voyage. I just found some comparable ones. So the ceremony is conducted by sailors on board. For those of you that don't know what it is, it's a long-standing tradition. They mark the crossing of the equator with a ceremony in which Neptune, or Poseidon, same, comes aboard, demanding tribute from those who have never crossed the line, being the equator, before. These novice sailors then graduate from being tadpoles to shellbacks or turtles. Not quite sure why they changed from tadpoles to turtles. Maybe it was an early misunderstanding, but that's what they do. And then they can style themselves sons of Neptune. It's a very superstitious practice. It's been going on for centuries, and they still do it now, I think. So Agnes related in her diary, 17 of our crew have not been across before. They can style themselves now sons of Neptune. They say that Neptune came on board last night at 12 and told them he would come today at 2 o'clock. And I just love the photographs. They look like they have the most amazing... Sorry, shouldn't turn around. They look like they have the most amazing fun because all the sailors get dressed up. The whole ceremony is they parade around the deck. In Agnes's time, they used the cannon. So they lashed the cannon together because they had wheels. And then they dressed a couple of the guys up as horses and they actually dragged them around on the deck. They go up, they shake the captain's hand because, of course, there's an etiquette, there's a protocol on board a vessel. And then they invite all the neophytes up and they get dunked. They're all baptised. And then they're officially sons of Neptune. I also found in the John Oxley, these are from the Royal Australian Navy, these photos. These are great. This one cracked me up a little. From the HMAS Sydney, they're using forklifts. I thought that was great. So that's actually a photo from the library here. It's in the collection here. And this is another one also from the collection, which is an American version. And it comes from we actually have the photos here so that you can look at them today. It's Americans in Queensland during World War II. You can see there's slight variances, but you've got the same thing. You've got the two seasoned sailors all dressed up. And you can see some of the photos from the American one where they're dunking the younger lads to baptise them. So moving on to the next one we have, so this was a bit of a weird one. This is talking about making connections. This was pure serendipity. I don't know if many of you saw this exhibition, Entwined. It was a lovely one. I couldn't get up here, so I read the blog and everything about it with great interest. And I absolutely loved this photograph, and I remembered the photograph. And then I was reading the diary of Janet Black Hall. Janet arrived in Brisbane as an infant with her parents, so her diary is later in her life. She's already established in Brisbane. And after her diary ends, she marries. So she married quite late in life for those days, about 37, and had 4 children with a Swedish surveyor and draftsman called Algot Hjalmar Forsell, which is a fantastic name. When you're a researcher, you love finding names like that because it's so much easier to find them in digital archives. You pop that name in and there's only one of them. So it made it really easy to trace her movements through Queensland by following Algot. Algot was... where am I up to? Sorry. So, yeah, back to this photo. This is the bicycles parked outside the Lands and Works office. It's obviously picked for the amazing Staghorn collection for this particular exhibition. And this was just before the Lands and Works office moved into the executive buildings, which are now part of the Treasury Casino complex over there. So her husband, Algot, was a surveyor. He also collected staghorns. Algot died in 1928 and willed his collection to the Lands Office. So I found this amazing clue to the origin of the collection in this photograph. Here we are. His obituary reads, when the survey office was situated in the old Lands Office, he inaugurated a collection of ferns, staghorns and elkhorns, a collection which is now housed in the courtyard of the executive buildings. This was with him a labour of love, and the government now sets aside £20 a year to pay for attention to this collection. So 2 seemingly completely unconnected objects that exist in the library are actually really closely connected. And it's just... I thought it was quite funny to think that perhaps one of those bicycles might have been Algot's as well, because he was working here at the time. And they lived in Milton and New Farm over the years, so he could have easily biked into work. But this was one example for me. It's just highlighted the point that these collection items need to be taken out and read and reread, and so that all of these linkages and discoveries continue to be made. Unless they're constantly at the forefront of people's minds, then the links between the collection items grow more and more tenuous as fewer people remember where they came from. And it really was sheer luck that I happened to have pulled Janet's diary from the archives the same year that one of the librarians decided to use this image in this collection. So I was really pleased to be able to make that link. Further research necessary, of course, but it does look like he was directly involved in this amazing collection. And I love staghorns too. They're absolutely stunning. Another young woman that I wrote about on the blog was Margaret Gray. So she too came out as a young woman with her family. She has a shipboard diary. Her diary was particularly enlightening in the way that it described conflict between the ship's surgeon, who was also the superintendent of all the passengers, and the ship's matron, who was in charge of the safety and well-being of the unmarried women on board. So I don't know if you're aware, but when they undertook these voyages, all single women travelled together on board ship in a single group, regardless of whether or not their parents or other family members were on board. The matron was an essential figure because she guarded not only the physical safety of the girls, but also their far more ephemeral and easily damaged reputations, which were very, very important in those days. They were really everything, particularly if they were going to survive in the colonies. Many of these young women were hoping to find employment when they got to Brisbane, for example. And if rumours got out that the unmarried women section of their ship was unruly, then no self-respecting woman employer would hire any of these girls to work in their households because they couldn't be seen to be encouraging or harbouring vice. And you would absolutely see write-ups in the paper. It was gossip. As soon as the ship docked, word would get out that things had been happening on board. It would be published in the paper, and all of those girls were out of work. Wouldn't matter whether or not they had been involved in the shenanigans. It was enough to simply be, tarnished by association. So while I mentioned her shipboard diary for the library blog, I didn't go into the other book that's archived with. And that is her sister Mary's employee record book. So Mary ran a laundry service, and in this book she lists approximately 70 women who were in her employment over the years. And I thought this was an amazing resource because this could potentially provide the descendants and relatives of all these 70 women with additional details of their lives. And these are the kinds of records which I think are really important because they provide insight to the lives of otherwise almost completely invisible women. They're working women. Apart from births, deaths and marriages, you don't really hear anything about them. So I'd love to see the names in this book transcribed and actually added to the catalogue data. So someday someone might find, a great-great-grandma as a young woman. Many of them are 16 to 20 years old when she takes them in to work. Their early years, probably before they got married, working in the laundry. Another similar type of object that I came across, same kind of thing, is the autograph books. These are lovely. So the diaries as well, but particularly the autograph books mention all the social connections of these women. So it's not the name, there are a lot of names mentioned in these books that people aren't necessarily aware of. We know the name, they're catalogued as say, the Janet Black Hall diary, but then she mentions, dozens of people throughout the diary. And that's the kind of information that's really important to get out there for people, because there's so many people interested in the history of their family, their neighbourhood. They might be writing a local history of their town, and there's information about these people kind of locked in these books that we don't really know about. So autograph books were quite the rage for quite a few years. Young women in particular would proffer these pretty much to everyone they spent time with, and they're a really good record of their social circles and the people they spent time with. It might even be possible, we don't actually know. So Amy is one of the photograph books. We don't know anything about Amy other than the autograph book was given to her by Vera, who was a friend, obviously, on her birthday, and it's inscribed with the date of her birthday, so we know Amy's birthday. Maybe one day, if I had enough time, I could go through all of Amy's social connections and actually work out who she is by association, but we don't quite know who she is yet. It would be very labour-intensive, but it would, a lot of dead ends, but it'd be great to try. The last diarist that I want to mention particularly today, there's so many of them honestly, is Veda Mansbridge. So this incredible collection, it's not simply a diary, it is piles of stuff. It's, boxes and boxes. This incredible archive was given to the John Oxley Library by the recipient's nieces back in the UK. So she sent all this to a friend called Mabel. Thankfully, they recognised what an important record of life in Queensland it was. And this is that collection. If I had not cast that wide net at the outset, I would not have known that this was here. And I think it's the best thing that I found. And I found some great things, but it's extraordinary. So Veda is absolutely everything. She is a diarist. She is a collager and scrapbooker, an embroiderer, a poet, a lyricist. She wrote music, a photographer. She presses flowers and she collects feathers and seeds. She's the correspondence version of a magpie. She's really visually motivated, but she's also quite descriptive, and she's very verbose too. So she also appears to feel a lot, and she's really passionate, and that comes through, and it's really warming to, you really feel like you're getting to know her as you're going through all of this material. She collected all of this material because she was bitterly upset to be leaving her friend, Mabel Rose. So this collection is almost an extension of a conversation. She's collecting everything that just appeals to her throughout her day, collating it all together into books, and then sending it en masse to Mabel in the UK. So it's almost as if they're trying to continue as they left off, but halfway around the world from each other. Yeah, it's very chatty and unself-conscious. It's almost like they're having a coffee together. And it's a shame we've only got the one half of the conversation. We don't know whether Veda, I'm sure Veda would have kept Mabel's half of the correspondence, but we don't know as of yet what happened to it. Veda was very intelligent. She composed song lyrics. I also found out she won an essay competition at one point. And she seems to be quite vivacious and determined to enjoy life. She worked for Kodak. She took a lot of photographs, which was unusual for the era. She and her mother were members of the Brisbane Women's Club, which was also known as the Progressive Women's Club. And they held positions in the club, including president and secretary, and they would have met people such as Lady Forster, who was the wife of the Australian Governor-General in 1922, because she came up to do some work with the club. It's not all good story. Veda's dad was no good. They had to leave him. He was not a very good man, and that's unfortunately a matter of public record. It ended up in the papers, his behaviour. But that, apart from all that, they seem to have had really a wonderful life here in Queensland, and it's amazing that we've got, that's part of the collection that we've got for you to have a look at here today. It's really lovely. So just in conclusion quickly, I mean, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. I could talk about a lot of the others during the Q&A, and I don't have enough time to share everything today, so I'm launching that website. They will be sending a link out for you if you want to look at that later on. The first chapter is already up. That's about Isabella Lucy Elliott, who was the wife of the first Speaker of the Queensland Assembly. They lived at that lovely old historic property down on Kangaroo Point that's still there, third oldest house in Queensland. So that was their home. I hope you enjoyed hearing about a selection of some of these women this evening. I hope that these diaries open some windows into what life was like and do inspire you to keep digging into the history of Queensland, because it really is fascinating. And after the Q&A, obviously ask lots of interesting questions, but please stick around and we'll show you some of these wonderful objects. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Alison. As you probably know, I'm Gavin Bannerman, and I'm from the Queensland Memory team at State Library of Queensland. So we've got an opportunity to ask questions of Alison. I'm sure through that presentation there's things which have popped into your mind and you're like, I really want to know this. So if you use the QR code, which hopefully is kind of second nature to us all now, you can then just pop a question in and we'll be able to get to it. But I probably wanted to just kick it off and just ask that question about, you talked about those two themes of discovery and connection. And it was really interesting to me because I think it's, you know, somebody who works in the library and is kind of exposed to this material all the time. I just wish I had more time to do that, to discover and make connection. And did you want to talk about that interplay between the two?
Sure. Look, I mean, I wish I could live 3 lifetimes more, you know, just to be able to go through. There's no way that one person can just adequately engage with all. It's amazing. It's just, I'm constantly filled with amazement. Sometimes even at the most mundane things, because it's so sweet, you know. We've got other slides of other things now, and there's Dorothy Leslie, the lovely one that's full of little images will come up. She talks about, you know, her little pets and her lovely parrot who's sick sometimes, and it's nothing revelatory, but at the same time, it's just so touching. So, and it is, it's the connections. And discovery as well. I mean, it's such a broad term, really, but it's, sometimes you discover something you hadn't really thought of before, but at the other time, well, I think what I discovered more than anything is just how universal we are as human beings, because they really are, you know, they're just like us. They may have lived in a different place, they may have had different problems, they may have been constrained by different social mores and everything. But yeah, you feel like you're just discovering someone who could be your neighbour or maybe a friend.
How do you think they'd feel about someone 100 years later reading their thoughts?
I'm not sure that all of them wanted people to. I mean, it can be quite delicate process because you don't. I don't want to speculate too much on what they meant by some things, and I don't necessarily want to bring everything in their diaries to light. Some of them are very, very tragic. Some of them talk about the deaths of their children and things like that, which was a very common occurrence, particularly for the families out in the country and limited access to any kind of medical support. And that feels a bit too personal. That felt a bit, I didn't want to, highlight that today. I will write about some of them. But yeah, they can be quite, it's quite distressing sometimes. Yeah. I don't know, I'm not sure that they thought that they were writing for an audience. I think they might have just been writing to get that sadness out, Yeah, it's a hard question. You've got to try and be ethical and try and just use your best judgment. Yeah. And sometimes stuff should stay closed, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, somebody has asked the question, about whether you found any stories that can't be included in your research, and obviously you probably won't disclose those stories. But I suppose taking that question and maybe delving a little bit more is, I think sensitivity is a big thing that is difficult to explain when working with material. But did you want to? I think intellectually explaining it doesn't make sense, but do you want to emotionally explain it?
I think the good rule of thumb is if a friend told you, would you tell someone else? You think about if it's something that really someone unburdened themselves to you because they were really upset, or they told you an absolutely terrible secret that would forever change other people's perception of them, for example. Sometimes those things do need to come out. Sometimes, you discover something new about someone that should change our perception of who that person was. But at other times, I think it's appropriate to maybe just leave it. It's in the diary, it's in the collection, it's not going anywhere. I just wouldn't necessarily highlight it as an aspect of their story. Treating them like a friend, I think, is probably the easiest way to describe it.
And how do you practice that self-care if you're coming across a lot of things which probably, there's a lot of unpalatable information, there's a lot of sorrow in there. It's a question that came up in a previous session we did with Fiona Foley, who was looking at Aboriginal perspectives around the Bachelor, Maryborough, Nari area, and the impacts, the ravages of opium and on that community. And the people were very interested to know how she looked after herself while navigating this troublesome material. Did you?
I tend to be fairly aware of how I'm feeling. I try to keep checking in with myself. So if something is really upsetting, I will just put it away for a little while. Sometimes I can't come back to those, and I don't punish myself with it. I don't feel like I have to do the job. I don't have to do the work. If it is too sad, is usually too sad, too personal. I recognise that I probably shouldn't be reading it anyway, and I just leave it. And there's always more material to work with. So, it's setting good limits for yourself. Yeah.
We've got some great questions, but a dumb question from me. Handwriting and just that getting into the groove of reading a cursive writing again. Did you have to, get a mode for each, because you're sort of locking into lots of very different kinds of handwriting?
Some of them are just difficult. Some of them you can get used to the way they write. And I'm still, because I read a lot of old records anyway, just in the course of work. So cursive in general, I'm not, bothered by, but some of them are just terrible handwriting. And it's really difficult. And to be honest, that's another self-care thing. I just go, you're too hard. I actually put it away.
I've got a theory that people with good handwriting get preferenced in the kind of in having historical work done on them.
Probably. I would say that's absolutely true. Yeah, because they're easier to read. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Some beautiful questions about the female perspective, and thanks Hannah for the question about the female perspective in the diaries, and whether it has revealed anything new or different about Queensland's history that was you hadn't known before.
I think there's nothing. I mean, in terms of the greater narrative of Queensland history, we know it's there. It's that domestic history, And it's just that different perspective on things. So I'm just trying to think of an example.
Was there an event where you could mark that you knew this event was happening in Queensland at that time? It's a, I don't know, you know, it's a coronation, or it's
it's
you know, there's a federation, or those kind of.
The one
events
that
happening.
actually really cracked me up, I don't know why this is the only one that sticks in my head, is Isabella Elliott, who was the wife of the first Speaker of the Queensland Assembly. She's so low-key that she would actually make me laugh, because she would describe these enormous, really momentous events, particularly in her husband's life, because he's in the state parliament. And sometimes the diary entry is just Parliament prorogued. That's it. And that's actually really important. But she's clearly not interested. She just didn't care. So, you know, Gil's come home, you know, thrown his hat or done whatever he's done, and you know, and that's it. It's just 2 words in her diary. She didn't care. I can't. They don't tend to talk too much about the bigger events, what I've found, or if they do, it's not really anything out of the ordinary. It's more, it's definitely more, it's more the neighbourhoods, and it's more getting to know, getting the sense of community. So that's something that probably doesn't come across in official histories. They've got the back end, you know, they've got the interior, the inside of everything that's happening. So they know what's going on, but it's all very personal. Yeah.
There's a question. Thanks, Louise, for the question about honesty, and you know, that's probably an interesting kind of question about, you know, taking what's written as on face value.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think it depends on their motivation for writing the diary in the first place, and you can see that in the diaries. Some of them are written very much as a narrative. It's almost as if they are writing a book of their life, and you get the expectation that means they want people to read it. And it's full of they're very descriptive, they're very emotive, but you've got to ask, how truthful are they being about what they're describing? Because they're obviously, anyone who's telling a story tells the good bits, and they put themselves in a certain light, and they'll represent themselves a certain way. And likewise, people they don't necessarily like particularly much might be represented in not so flattering light. Other women who just use their diaries as a kind of aide de memoire in a way are more honest. You can probably trust what they're saying because they're not really caring. There's no emotional input. It's not as much fun to read them, but you can get some nuggets of really interesting information out of them. One of the ones I think is great, it's in terms of honesty, is the Dorothy Leslie one, which I think we've got, the images. She's 15, and I think just because she's 15, she's completely unfiltered. So if she doesn't like someone, she's, you know, her piano teacher was horrible today, and she's such a and you know, she just writes exactly what she's thinking.
Are they like status updates? Do they read like
it's that? Pretty much, yeah. It's the 1908 equivalent of you know, angry Twitter or Instagram posts or something. Yeah. I hate you. But it's great. So that one I think is probably the most honest one I've come across. But like most teenagers, she only keeps about half a year, and then she just gets bored and puts it away and never comes back to the diary again. She finds something else to do, which is a real shame, because she's really talented with that, you know, the pen with all those little sketches that she's put in.
They are great. We do have a few diaries or photograph albums or artworks by teenagers, and I think it's such an interesting lens to use one of your analogies of how to look at things around you, because they do just. That distance between experience something and putting it down is pretty immediate. Yeah. And
there she is.
I just wonder, have you had any experiences of people who you're looking at their diaries and there was a significant passing of time in their life, and whether they changed over time or whether that voice stayed constant through their life?
Yeah, there's quite a few. They stop and start, and it's kind of, it's not always easy to figure out what's happened in the meantime. I go to the obvious things, like maybe someone passed away, maybe they moved, but I actually, more often than not, I find real difficult. I think they possibly just get engaged elsewhere. They lose interest, or they just, you know, once you get out of the habit, and sometimes they get back into the habit, they make that conscious decision to pick up the pen again and start writing again. Sometimes there's a few days. You can see the tail off. You know it's coming because they'll write every day, then every second day, then once a week. Then they might come back half-heartedly after a month, and then it's 4 years later. And every single one, when they do that, they're all really similar like that. So yeah, I think it's losing interest more than anything else.
A big thing, and the Queensland Memory team at State Library, we make a lot of decisions about what to acquire and what we bring into the collection. And we often talk about, you know, the significant and the unique, and collecting, you know, like these unpublished diaries. You know, there is literally one of these, and sometimes they have information which is contained nowhere else, and it's this very personal, identifiable, you know, tangible piece of documentary heritage of a particular time. But I was interested to hear what you said about these are important, but then you also contextualise this very idiosyncratic view of the world with the larger social context at the time. Yeah. And everyone loves Trove, but also those other resources which helped you paint that, you know, maybe the backdrop of who this character is. Did you want to talk about that interplay between those kinds of materials?
I love Ancestry. I know that's not, you know, it wasn't considered a professional tool, but they've got so much stuff on there right now. There's criminal records and all kinds of amazing things now. It's not just births, deaths and marriages. And I've used that for a few of them, particularly the public servants. It's fantastic. There's government gazettes. You can find out a lot more about where they worked, where they moved from, for example, Algot, the Swedish gent. He went up to Rockhampton for a while for work, and then possibly Townsville as well, I think, from memory. I can't remember. There's so many. I am getting them a bit confused in my head. But yeah, you can use, there's, I use anything I can, basically, anything I can get my hands on. So newspapers are great, but then, there's so many other government records, and they're just slowly being put into that Ancestry database, and it's brilliant. Yeah. So anyone can do it. They really can. It's one thing I like about the democratisation of all that information. You can sign into Ancestry and just find anything these days.
Another kind of the material which I think was within some of the diaries were recipes.
Yes,
So did you want to talk a little bit about that? And there's a follow-on question. Did you try to cook any of them?
No, I haven't had time. I've actually got a whole bunch of food intolerances, which is really boring, but it means I probably couldn't cook most of them anyway. I could test them out of my family. I don't know how they'd feel about that. That's Margaret's diary, Margaret Gray. She's got a whole bunch of recipes at the front. I think the image that I had it's probably in the presentation. So it's like she's preparing for her journey she's about 18. She's obviously travelling to the colony. She's going with family. One of the things the women did have to do on board, though, the single women, was do a bit of cooking for themselves. So she's gathered all these useful recipes. Some of them sound pretty awful. But they're pies and puddings and all, just the useful everyday things that women will need to take care of themselves. I'm trying to think of another diary. There are others that have got the recipes in them. Sometimes they're swapping recipes too. So if they've gotten something from a friend, they'll write it down as well. Yeah. But I guess it's the main way that people communicated was, you had to write everything down then. You've got to think about it. And recipes from those days are quite interesting as well because they don't contain the measurements the way that we have today. They're a real challenge to try and actually reproduce. I used to work a little bit with Jackie, who works for Sydney Living Museums. She's their historian, cook, chef. And part of her job is to actually find all these old recipes and desperately try and muddle through and work out how you make them. Because it'll be get some of this and get some of that, put them together, and then you've got a meal. And she's like, well, that's not... I don't know what to do with that.
It's a high-level recipe.
It's just, a list of ingredients without any kind of proportional help. And they just wrote it down as an aide de memoire. Yeah. So they would make it themselves, knowing that they needed a pinch of this and a cup of that. And so it would be fun to try and work them out. Maybe we should do a recipe book.
That'd be fun. Yeah, State Library recipe book.
Yeah.
Is there an example of is variations of that question that have come through? What's one story that particularly struck you and stayed with you?
I tell you what, there's a good one. It is one that I'm going to write up and put on the website. One kind of diary I haven't talked about is the one where they actually write in the voice of another person. So usually children. And there's Laurie Smith, and she's the one, it's got the pansies in the diary. It comes up in the slideshow. She's writing in the voice of the little girl that she's nannying for, who's about 3 years old. Her name is Debonair Metcalf. And the Metcalfs are a very wealthy family. They lived in Toowoomba. Dad played cricket for Queensland. They're big in the military. They're very heavily involved in a lot of colonial enterprise in particularly in India. They don't have a great reputation for that. Some of the family members, they obviously did some things that were a bit regrettable. She moves, Debonair, after this diary, after Laurie's had her, moves back to London and grows up in this incredible dress circle house and is engaged to a man in India, goes to marry the young officer in India, ends up running away with another woman who is also married. They run away to Austria, where they live together for a while. Terrible relationship. Debonair, this is the very fast version of this story. This woman is incredible. Debonair ends up in London again after she splits up with her girlfriend, and she starts writing plays. And I haven't been able to track down any of her written work yet, but it does exist in I've got to get access to it. She wrote a play called The Green Room, I think it's called, or it's The Green something. It's fallen out of my head, I'm sorry. And there is a legend about this play, and I don't know whether people know it. They might know it from the other end. It is the main character in this play launched the career of Vivien Leigh. And there's the legend in circles in London, in theatre circles, is that the word going around about this play was there was not much substance to it, and all the lead had to be was gorgeous. Said, you've just got to stand there and look beautiful. And Vivien went, that's me. And she went and auditioned and got the role. And that's the beginning of her career. And it starts with a little girl called Debonair. I mean, if you call someone Debonair, they're not going to be boring, are they? You're kind of writing her story for her before she's even grown up. But yeah, Debonair grew up in Toowoomba, and her nanny's diaries in the collection here. And those little pansies that come up in the picture when it comes around were picked by little Debonair, and they're actually stuck in the diary. So that's got to be my favourite in terms of adventure and excitement. She's fantastic.
It's a great point somebody makes as a question about finishing a good book and then having that sense of missing the characters. Do you feel like this with any of the women? Would you want to be friends with any of them?
I'd love to meet Veda. I don't know that I'd be able... she'd either be amazing or you'd have to get away from her eventually, because I think she's just so... she's incredible, but she might be too much.
Yeah.
But look, she was amazing. And if you had to live in that era, I think that's the woman you'd want to know, because she was very ahead of her time. There's also Bertha Pears. And she's very forward-thinking for her era. She's a suffragette, and she is an ancestor of the Packers, I think, as well. That's another connection that's in the library. One of the diaries that I haven't been able to write up yet, but she's interesting. Her nephew, who donated the libraries, said that she always put him in mind of an intelligent, bedraggled parrot, which is not very complimentary, but I think he was trying to say she was just full of colour and movement, and she smoked. She was orange, like her hair was all, she was quite eccentric, but very, very bright. And she wrote, she was one of the few early, I think, women journalists or writers in Brisbane. And yeah, that's another amazing legacy. I haven't had time. There's just so many of them, which is hence the website. I'm going to try and get them all up there this year for you, so that you've got that lasting record of them. Yeah.
There was a question, sorry, it's just come off, but about shipboard diaries or passage diaries, and it's a bit of a trope in movies or in literature, but it's the road trip. It's that journey. It's a journey of self-discovery as much as physical transit. Did you want to talk about those kind of, because it was at that time the only way to get your experiences down, and that passage of not knowing what's on the other side, and you're processing your thoughts. I can't think of a better thing to do. Well,
yeah, I think honestly the diaries, the shipboard parts of the diaries, while they're interesting insights into what it was like to be on the ship and to be travelling, I haven't seen that much in terms of, it's more that they're doing it to distract themselves because they're really bored than anything else. So there's nothing, you don't really see them, maybe at the outset, sort of the first day, they'll be going, woe is me, I'm leaving my home, or I'm really scared, I don't know what's going to happen. That might be how they open the diary. Usually by the end of the first day, they're so seasick that all they write about for the next 3 days is how often they throw up. That's literally quite a lot of the diaries, is how much everyone is being sick. And whether or not, and it's almost a victory to finally eat food. And that is a commonality in all the shipboard diaries. That's all they talk about for the first week is, yay, I ate food today. Yeah.
It is funny with a lot of wartime diaries that the amount of food and rations just get discussed. It sort of brings you back down to your very base needs sometimes. Yeah. Have you noticed any commonalities shared between these women, often from slightly different eras and locations and social strata?
They definitely have a lot in common because, their lives have to revolve around domesticity, regardless of what they do. And they do, when they talk about their day, it is quite often, there's always saw such and such today. They will all inevitably tell you about who they met throughout the day, that they had to go shopping. They all mention shopping. It's a big part of their experience. Not necessarily in a fun sense. They don't go shopping for fun. They've actually just got to go in. But it's also a big trip into town too, even if they live quite close. If they have to go into Brisbane to shop, wow. Even if they only live over at Kangaroo Point, it's a day out. Commonalities, look, I think the main commonalities are that they're just so universal. You feel you have just as much in common with them today as they all would have had in common with each other 100 or 150 years ago. I don't think the human experience has changed very much, even for all of our change. We're all still very much human beings, and we're still doing the same thing every day. We get up, we get dressed, we have breakfast, we take the kids to wherever they're going for the day, and we go to work, and it's all the same. That's the commonality. It's interesting to, yeah.
Stuart, just a couple more questions, and we will get to the collection materials. Stuart asked a question about resilience and whether that came across in reading the material. He asked that we often question our resilience in today's world, and it'd be interesting to get a sense of their world. Do you think?
Yeah, I think resilience, because it was very much their mindset was do it. So it didn't matter what happened, you got up and you kept going. And I think we're more sensitive to people needing to be mentally healthier than we were back then, certainly. There's Betty, what's her name? Betty Clark, and someone has actually already written a book about her that's in the library. Her diary, gosh, that's one that's hard to read as well. In terms of her resilience, she's out on the farm, often by herself with kids. The kids are sick, the kids are dying. There's this never-ending, something's always going wrong, always for these women out on land. And it's really hard to read. That's one of the ones that's really hard to read. But yeah, I couldn't, in terms of their resilience, I couldn't do it. I'm not sure that anyone today has been, it's trauma. We would recognise it now as just constantly being trauma. We'd actually be actively trying to rescue someone if they were in that situation. But back then, if you were a woman on the land and things were getting tough, you just kept going. Yeah, I think we're very different in that sense today to what they were then. They obviously would have felt it just as much as we do today, but they weren't allowed to. There was no out. You couldn't say, I'm sinking, someone help me, I can't do this anymore. You just had to keep going.
There's an interesting question about what's a contemporary version of, these diaries, and we were, sort of joking about diaries being, the social media of the 19th century, but, would you, if you were to be doing this in the future, where do people put their innermost thoughts, and how would you start to piece together the vision of people of today?
It's a really good question, because I think diaries are very different to, like, the physical diary, the one that you're writing in, as opposed to websites and the publicly available stuff. Is people are going to represent themselves very differently, and they're not going to tell you their innermost secrets, unless they're, they have a specific purpose in mind in telling you that. There are digital diaries. People do keep diaries that aren't publicly available. But that would be a matter of, do you ever see it? Do you ever find it? You know, is someone just going to throw the hard drive in the bin when that person passes away? Would you ever know it was there? So there will still be diaries in one form or another, I think, around. And you could add to those by looking at the person's Tumblr account from when they were a teenager. I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You might have a digital diary, but then you've got their old Facebook account. And
The
then,
Wayback Machine, if you haven't accessed, is great. The Internet Archive is good.
yeah, it's just imagine, you know, all the silly questions they used to ask on Reddit and stuff like that. If you could find
Their username. You need to just connect
you find the username,
to
and then that would be the new
that would be
research.
unlocking.
That'd be what you'd be looking for. It'd be, I've got this diary from you know, Jane Smith, but what was her tag? What was her handle? So you've got to find all their usernames and then go back, and then you'd be able to fill in the blanks with everything they actually got up to in their lives. People are weird online. I think you could actually find out quite a lot about someone if you aggregated all of it.
That's just to round it out, so why are diaries and first person accounts so important as an avenue of inquiry?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's, I don't know, it's possibly part of the human condition. We really want to know people. We're social animals. So many people have such a strong, they're just so strongly drawn to history in general, and I don't think people could even understand why, other than I love it. You know, I think it's just part of who we are as human beings. We love our history. And people are personal. You know, once you've got an individual, a diary, that history becomes personal, and it becomes like getting to know someone. It's like gaining a new friend. You live their life. It's no different really to reading a novel that you really enjoy, I think, in a way, and that you can get really heavily involved in the characters and feel kind of sad when it's over. You know, especially when the diaries only go for a year or two. It starts when they're 18 and stops when they're 20, and you're like, but what happened to you? You know, that's when I start getting into all those other records and madly trying to find out where they went and what they did, because you can't be satisfied. You need the sequel. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think it's that they're so personal. I think that's why people connect with them. Yeah. And
last question. Your project's explicitly about female voices and those experiences on the page. Do you feel it's changed your beliefs or thoughts about women and women's experiences?
It was nice to see these women of independence. I mean, I find them quite interesting because they're very much before their time. They refused to marry, they kept jobs, they expressed very strong opinions. The ones like Veda, who are really creative, so they just decided she was going to write music for a while, and then she was going to be a photographer for a while, and then this, that and the other. It's nice to see that breadth of experience that they had, that not all of them were. I think it's easy to, even as an historian, to just assume that women didn't get to do as much then as they do now, and of course that's not necessarily the case. So it's a good refresher going through these diaries, reminding me that they're actually capable of quite a lot. But yeah, I guess that's the best way to answer that one. And look, they're just amazingly, we go back to that word resilient. That's the thing that comes through with these women. Even the wealthier diarists like Isabella or, you know, Debonair with her nanny, they still experience tragedy and heartbreak. You know, Isabella lost a son in his 30s very suddenly. And it's, they're all human. And it's, I don't think it really changed my opinion, but it did. It reminded me that they're all individuals and all very human and all capable of quite extraordinary things when they set their mind to it. So,
well, that's a great note. Thank you so much, Alison.
No worries.
So we will have an opportunity to look at some of the material. We'll bring the table out a little bit more so everyone can have a look at some of the material and ask Alison questions about it. Just a few notes, because some of these are quite rare items. The diaries, which are uncovered by Mylar, which is a kind of a conservation sort of grade plastic. Please don't touch any of those. There are some albums and facsimile copies of material which you're more than welcome to touch, but just the things out on the pillows, we'll just look but don't touch, please. And I'd just also like to give a plug for an upcoming event. This is this will be on next week will be the last of the Research Reveals series, which is where we present the research outcomes of our fellows from 2020. So you're welcome to, you're invited to attend the presentation Women of the Great Barrier Reef, which is Dr. Deb Anderson and Associate Professor Kerry Foxwell-Norton, as they share the outcomes of their project, which is looking into and inspired by the story of Terry Ridgway, who in 1966 quit her typing pool job in Brisbane and moved to a remote island in the Great Barrier Reef. Aged 19, I wonder if she kept a diary, she became the girl Robinson Crusoe, living solo and spending her time studying marine life, aiming to identify the more than 1,500 species of reef fish. So come along and listen to Deb and Kerry's research as they shine a light on this story and ask them questions about their research as well. It's at the same time from 6 to 7 on the 16th of February. Also, I should have pointed out that this session is being live streamed and next week's will be live streamed as well. Plus also a recording is made of this so that if you have friends or contacts who weren't able to make it, this will be available through the State Library website shortly. Once again, I'd just like to say thank you, Alison. Thank you for braving travel and COVID and all these sorts of things to bring this new knowledge to light. And I look forward to hearing a few stories over the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you.